Mark, I'd like you to talk a little bit. Why don't you give us some examples of the things that you're doing today, some things that you're intensely proud of, so the audience can understand, Nestle's policies on sustainability.
Absolutely. And before I get to that, by the way, the same applies, at least on a regional level, to consumer preferences, because not all of these preferences are the same across the globe. And hence, trying to tailor your message to the consumer you're trying to serve in a particular region, I think, is also important. Now, when it comes to global projects, clearly the flagship initiative in our case is our net zero roadmap. This is built on the assumption that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is one of our key sustainability problems of our time. If we don't get a handle on some of these emissions, I think the climate consequences will grow increasingly worse, and it'll place costs on all of us. And food and beverage around the world stands for about 25 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. So I know everyone in this area always thinks about heavy industry or energy generation or air travel, but food and beverage accounts for a big part. And so we believe that this is an area where we can make a difference. So we were one of the signatories to the Science Based Targets Initiative. We signed that in 2019. We committed to net zero by the year 2050. In the year 2020, we issued, in line with these rules, a time-bound plan on how to get there. It calls for a minus 20% reduction by 2025, minus 50% by 2030. And this is independent of the growth of the company. So we kept growing, but our emissions have already come down below our 2018 baseline. We're very proud of that.
So, I'm curious about how goals like that, targets like that, are received within the company, because if you're a plant manager downstream, or if you're somebody in the sales department, it may be difficult to reconcile a directive like that versus the intense pressure in our industry to produce, especially during COVID, where demand went up well beyond what their average factory could sustain. I'm just curious about how it was received in the company.
You're absolutely right. It's a humongous challenge to tackle, and making that plan happen is a massive undertaking. The good news when it comes to Nestlé values and the Nestlé culture is that environmental responsibility and environmental concerns were always pretty high on our list, and so it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to convince people of the necessity to do this. The way to make it stick then, especially at times that are challenging, like during the COVID years, is rather than insisting on a one-size-fits-all across the entire company, you have to take the liberty to break it down into different speed levels, if you will, either by category or by geography. And that depends on environmental factors. It depends on the kind of footprint that each and every one of these categories has. So, for example, in our portfolio, clearly the greenhouse gas footprint associated with dairy is a heavier one than for coffee. At the same time, many dairy products face a much more competitive environment than coffee, which is doing really well for us. And so this is where different categories have to shoulder different burden levels. And I think by making the burden level achievable to the category you're talking to, I think this is one of the ways to really create traction inside the company and make it happen. Overall, on a consolidated basis, of course, we need to meet our targets, but it doesn't mean that everyone has to go at exactly the same pace.
I love that answer. I think that it's easy to get caught up in the tyranny of the urgent. Comp sales issues, or the trucks are showing up at the back room and they're not complete, or you got customers mad at you about masks, and sort of down on your priority list, wherever sustainability issues were, reducing waste, recycling, where these, it was easy to rationalize pushing those initiatives down. And yet without the targets and the goals, you could go backwards. You could easily go backwards. And what I love about what you and your company have done is you set those targets and you continue to make progress despite all of those kinds of challenges. So I think that's amazing. It's interesting to me. I love what you've done in terms of making sustainability and human issues kind of linked together. So on your website, you talk about everything from the percentage of females in leadership role, to protecting human rights, to sustaining small farmers. I think I'd like to, if you can, Mark, and I know we probably didn't practice this question, but it's a little bit new. But I'd like you to talk about, your commitment to that, because I think it's both laudable and it's fascinating.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I talked a lot about the greenhouse gas emissions reduction, but you're right. I mean, when we talk about a sustainable approach to business, one that serves mankind as opposed to just strip mining the planet, there are so many dimensions that need to be fulfilled. And so it has to do with our emissions. It has to do with, for example, the quality of our food and beverage products. It has to do with how we're dealing with suppliers and business partners, upstream, downstreams, business partners. It has to do with how we deal with our associates as an employer. And so clearly there's lots of dimensions here from, on the one hand, some hard chemical factors such as greenhouse gas emissions and plastics waste, to, on the other hand, softer and more social factors such as human rights, diversity and inclusion, and making everyone feel that they're part of one team, Nestlé, around the world. So there's so many dimensions, and just picking one and driving back to the hilt is probably not doing the complexity of our business situation and the food and beverage category overall justice.